Welcome to Science with Susanna, and in this video we're going to go through a brief history of microbiology. I love this page of our notes, and as you can see you're going to need a lot of different colors, and I've even set them up here in order. So you want purple, green, blue, pink, orange, and black with a yellow highlighter for that one. And we're going to color code all of these different scientists that have been working hard over the centuries to help us learn about micro. And when we're done, our page is going to look something like this. So, without further ado, here we go. Let's start with Robert Hooke in the 1660s. So on your timeline, make a little line right here. In purple, put 1660s. And then we're going to talk about Robert Hooke way up here at the top of the page. Put him right here. Robert Hooke. Let me just make sure you can see that. Nope, you can't. Sorry. Okay, here he is. Robert Hooke with an E on the end. This is a British fellow. And back then, in order to be a microbiologist, you basically were an inventor. So what he did was he built a microscope. And a microscope is essentially just curved glass. So you had to be like a glass blower, and you'd get the glass hot, and then they could bend it a little bit. And if they bent it so that it didn't have too many wrinkles in it, then they could get a pretty nice magnified image. And he would look at different things under the microscope, and probably back then he might have been enjoying himself a nice glass of red wine, and so he would look at cork under the microscope, and he saw these little rectangles, which we now know are plant cells. And so he coined the term cell. Oops. And what it referred to is that back then, the monks in the monasteries had very austere rooms that were just small and rectangular like that, and that's where what they reminded him of. So he was actually looking at dead plant cells, because cork is like the outer part of around a tree. So what I'd like you to do is take your pen and put a nice arrow down here, and then take your purple highlighter and trail right along like that. And you now have your first date on there. 1660s, Robert Hooke from England built one of the first microscopes ever. And then a contemporary of his, that means a scientist that was working at the same time, was right around the same time, but we're going to put 1670s on here. Oops, sorry, I did that again. So 1670s right here. And we're going to put his name right next to Robert's. And his name was Anton, I think Dutch. And so his name is spelled like this, but it's pronounced Leeuwenhoek. So Anton Leeuwenhoek. He also built a microscope because, again, if you were interested in science in those days, you essentially were a tinkerer. You were mechanical. You would build things to solve your own questions, like, can I look at something that is smaller than what I can see with my eyes? So he built a microscope. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't have put that there. And then the other thing I want to point out about him, which I just love, is that this guy was enthusiastic. So enthusiastic. He would go down to the bar and he would get people that were heading out and ask him if he could scrape their teeth and look at it under the microscope. And he was an artist. That was also common for scientists long ago, because they had to draw everything they saw because there weren't cameras. He drew amazingly accurate pictures. And these images were of microscopic organisms that we now would call protists and bacteria. And his drawings were so good that you can go look at them today. You could Google it as soon as you're done here, or pause the video and go Google it. And his drawings were so good that scientists today can actually identify the organisms that he was looking at down to, probably down to the genus level generally, but pretty amazing stuff he did. So we're putting a green arrow to the 1670s and highlighting that like so. And now we're going to jump ahead about 100 years to 1796. And in 1796, Edward Jenner went down in history as making the first official vaccine. So we'll put his name right here, Edward Jenner. I think he might have been Scottish, but he worked in rural northern England. And he's credited with the first vaccine. Now, I say credited because there were people throughout history that have found that if someone got sick with one kind of illness, sometimes they were less likely to get sick with a similar illness. And there were even some tribes in Africa that were known for finding different ways, and in India, I think, for finding different ways of inoculating against smallpox. So I just want to say that he's credited with the official first vaccine, but it's not like people weren't aware of this phenomenon in a different sort of way in earlier years. Okay, so he was credited with the first vaccine, and it was for smallpox. And it's called vaccine from the word vacca, which is Latin for cow. And that's because what he found is if someone was stricken with cowpox, infection, then provided smallpox protection. So, in other words, what would happen is if someone was infected with cowpox and then later on they were exposed to smallpox, they didn't get sick from it. And the way he proved this is very controversial. He actually took a young boy, I believe that it was like the son of his gardener, which was like his servant, but I come across different things on that. But anyway, he was a young boy for sure, and they purposely infected him with cowpox, and then they they waited like a week or two, and then they purposely infected him with smallpox, and he didn't get sick. Edward Jenner was made fun of. Also, you can look up some of the political cartoons from those times in London, and they would make cartoons that if someone got this vaccine, then they turned into a cow or they started acting like a cow. So the history around that is amazing if it's something that you would like to research a little bit more. But what I'd like to make sure we have on here, so this is controversial, because he experimented on a child. Experimented on a child. Okay, so next up, we are going to jump ahead about 50 years now to the most tragic figure in all of microbiology. And some of you may have heard of this guy if you've watched documentaries on this sort of thing. So we're going to put 1847 on here next. So getting to the middle of the 1800s. And we're going to put Semmelweiss's name up here near the top of the page. His first name was Ignaz Semmelweiss, and he was Hungarian, but he did his work in Vienna, Austria. And I am going to throw it out there and say I think this guy might have been one of the first well-known scientists that had OCD, or obsessive compulsive. But if it weren't for that, he would not have been saving people's lives. So listen to what happened. He noticed that women that would have to have their babies in the hospital, because that was less common back then, most people still had their babies at home, but if they had their babies in the hospital, they were more likely to die of infection after the baby was born. And what he noticed was that the medical students who delivered the babies, since they considered baby delivering to be beneath the doctors that had been finishing their training, which was pretty sexist. But anyway, so they had the medical students delivering the babies, and the medical students had to do their autopsies in the morning for whoever had been brought in dead off of the streets that night. And so they had just finished doing their autopsies, and then they would go upstairs and they would deliver babies. So Semmelweis was like, maybe, just maybe, if they wash their hands, fewer women will get infections. So he implemented hand washing as a requirement, and he would put signs on all the doors around the hospital. And this was very unpopular, but he required this hand washing before delivering babies. So since they didn't know about bacteria then causing disease, they didn't understand that if they washed their hands, that could save lives. So he was, this was super successful though, and it reduced childbirth deaths, I want to say from like 13% down to 4%. You might want to check that though. But anyway, he reduced childbirth infections dramatically. However, he was shunned by his colleagues. He was ignored and ridiculed. Can you be ignored and ridiculed? So he was either ignored or ridiculed. I'll put or. By his colleagues. And the medical students hated him. They thought he was super annoying and strict because he made them do all this stuff. And he published a paper showing the dramatic decrease in deaths after the hand washing was implemented, and the data was simply ignored. And I really want to point this out as a great example of something that sadly does happen in science, which will prevent things from sort of making progress for a while. I've seen this happen in things like nutrition research. I've seen it happen in microbiology for certain, in certain things with neurobiology research, etc., where the data is ignored for a while because it doesn't fit with the common understanding, and then it takes a lot more time for things to take hold, even after the science is pretty well established. Okay, so nowadays, though, he gets called the savior of mothers. So that's sort of his nickname. There's a lot of nicknames in microbiology that we'll look at on this page. But the saddest and the most tragic part of all of this is that he was so unpopular that, and I sometimes I'm not sure if this whole part of the story is true, but apparently his own wife worked together with some of his detractors, and they arranged for him to think that he was getting a promotion at a nearby or a hospital in another town, and they put him on the train, and then instead of getting off the train at the new hospital, they put him in an insane asylum. And in that place, we don't know if he was beat up or if something happened, but he got some sort of an injury, and he died of infection, of blood infection, the same kind of blood infection that had been killing the women from childbirth. So the whole thing is quite ironic and extremely tragic. So he was unpopular, and it's believed he was betrayed by his own wife. And he died in an insane asylum. So I challenge anyone to find a more tragic character in all of microbiology history than this guy. Okay, so let's do one more, and then we're going to stop this video and we'll do another segment on it. So we're going to jump to the 1850s now. So I'm using my orange pen. Oh, we have to do one more thing. So here's 1850s, but make your line going from poor, sad Semmelweiss with pink, and then put that with your highlighter. And things really start getting moving now in these 1850s. This is when they really start figuring out this hand washing thing has got something going for it. Because now our next person is Florence Nightingale. And Florence Nightingale is considered the mother of nursing, and kind of considered the reason that nursing became a thing. She also has another nickname called the Lady with the Lamp. And I'll tell you why in a second. So usually in pictures of her, you'll see her carrying her, I think it's probably like a kerosene lamp around as she looks at patients throughout the night. So Florence Nightingale was a rich British girl, and she would normally have been probably like sewing and never having a career, right? But then she had a brain, and she wanted to use that brain, and she was super good at math. She was very gifted at math, and she was lucky enough to have a tutor. And she specifically loved statistics. And so what happened is that the British soldiers were dying in I think it was the Crimean War, I think against Russia. And so there were these British soldiers that were, on the battlefields, and instead of just dying from wounds, they would come back to camp and they were dying of typhoid fever. And this was because the camp was so dirty that there was poop and feces, and they didn't have a good place to go to the bathroom, and they weren't washing sheets. And so one of the soldiers that would get this diarrheal disease, typhoid fever, and then it would quickly pass to other soldiers. And if they were already wounded, then weakened, and then they would die from this. So what she did was she used her statistics to show that more of the soldiers were dying from illness than from the war itself. And then what she did is she, similar to Semmelweis, but I think that Florence Nightingale had better social skills. And so instead of everyone being annoyed with her, they actually adored her. Maybe it also helped that there probably weren't very many women around. And although she wasn't considered to be very pretty, the soldiers would see her coming down the aisles between their beds at night, and they thought she was like an angel to come take care of them because they missed their home and they didn't feel good, and this woman was taking the time to take care of them. So implementation of good hygiene practices like hand washing and also washing the bedding. She would boil the bedding to clean it. And this reduced deaths from typhoid fever. Oh, and the other thing I was going to tell you about her is that her parents were very disappointed that she went to go be a nurse at that time, because they felt that that was beneath her having a career. So we'll put that in orange. Okay, so this video has already gotten pretty long. You can tell this is a really fun topic though. So we'll come back for part 2 of A Brief History in a bit.